Okay, so I only have 15 minutes, so I can't say thank you all for coming. I just want to let Barry know, however, that my class this semester is meeting at 8 o'clock in the morning, and we get almost 100% attendance. We don't start until we have a quorum, and we're usually right on time. So. Okay, enough of that. Charles gave me sort of the marching orders to go through a number of topics, which, as I looked at the agenda, looked like writing the overture for this musical that's about to play on. And so the overture really does come in support of the Wesleyan statement that Ed introduced last night. It's kicking around. This is a principal statement about pricing carbon as opposed to climate policy, responding to climate or whatever, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. The outline of my talk, very quickly, I'm going to rely on a lot of different sources and colleagues of mine to present these various themes that we'll go through. There's many too many slides for 15 minutes. The time signs just moved. I'm going to have to watch you over there. As we go through them, some of them I'll stop and talk a little bit longer on. Others of them will wander through fairly quickly to whet your appetite for probably subsequent panels. It's my understanding that the slides will be made available online so you can read them at a slightly more leisurely pace. So the outline of my remarks goes on for 2 slides. It ends with an idea that investment in mitigation, this limiting, this pricing carbon, is an investment in moving the distributions of possible temperature increases and the corresponding effects down in the appropriate direction. It's not guarantees. It doesn't specify that certain desirable futures will occur. It just makes them more likely. For groups like this and for organizers, that becomes part of the difficulty in communicating because you're really buying a reduced likelihood, and how do you go out and see that? It's not like the new Chevrolet. You can't see it and drive around and it's not blue. My motivation is this. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this. This is actually a sentence that I'm really proud of. IPCC has been criticized widely by some of being extraordinarily conservative. Fourth assessment report finally concluded that warming was unequivocal and with very high confidence humans were to blame, which meant that in 2007 we caught up to Jim Hansen, who said the same thing before the United States Senate in 1988. But there are reasons for that, and that's the adjective intergovernmental. That means that conclusions that are elevated to the summaries for policymakers are presented to all of the countries who have signed on to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and they have to agree to every sentence in the summary for policymakers, word for word, unanimously. And so it is not surprising that previous assessments have been relatively conservative. This one, however, is page 22, the summary for policymakers of the synthesis report, and it says responding to climate change involves iterative risk management process. Risk is really important. Iterative is the source of the 3rd paragraph in the principles. It involves both mitigation and adaptation, so you have to think of the 2 things together. We were talking about mitigation at the moment. But it takes into account the things that Tom just talked about. Not only climate damages, but co-benefit, sustainability, equity, and attitudes towards risk. There are a couple of reasons I'm really pleased with this, but one is the unanimous acceptance by 193 countries that this is a risk problem, including the United States. Risk is probability times consequence, and what that says to me is that our clients in the 5th assessment report, the countries of the world, have said they want to hear about high risk potential. And if there are conclusions that don't quite have the same degree of confidence and relative likelihood, given what the science is telling you and what the peer-reviewed literature is telling you, but can be associated with key vulnerabilities and high consequences, they want to hear about that. And that's, I hope, a game changer with respect to how the assessments are going forward. As we prepare for the 5th assessment report, it's becoming clear that the authors get it, the new uncertainty guidance is built around risk, and so on. As I move forward, though, I'm also going to pick up on a couple of themes from the America's Climate Choices Initiative, as well as Susan Solomon's Stabilization Committee. One of the panels was on limiting for the America's Climate Choices. Here's a list of the memberships. And it has a number of core recommendations that are particularly appropriate for this group. One is, and it's sort of the first and almost the only recommendation that they really want unanimously across the panel, as well as the Uber Committee for the America's Climate Choices, have to price carbon. They were ambivalent about how. They were happy with cap and trade or happy with a tax, but pricing carbon was absolutely essential. Then they go on to talk about complementing the pricing of carbon with a variety of things, some policies that promote energy efficiency, accelerate the retirement of bad ideas. Third, create new technology choices by investing heavily in crafting and researching and crafting policies that stimulate innovation. These are all sorts of things of what to do with the money. Consider the potential. This is really hard. My old eyes can't see that, and I can't see this very well when I look at you. But consider the equity implications, which also has to do with what you want to do with the money. Establish the United States as a leader in the effort to adopt greenhouse gas emission strategies, reduction strategies. Enable flexible and experimentation with policies. This is a recognition of the iterative component. And design policies that balance durability and consistency with flexibility and the capacity to make course corrections. How do you think about what the United States should be doing when it's a global problem? And their thoughts are indicated here. What they call is a safe level of climate change, Susan Solomon calls it a climate change for which there is an acceptable level of risk, both of which are personal subjective decisions that involve the political process. But then wander that down to what that means with respect to concentration targets, and then what is the appropriate share for the United States with respect to contributing to progress towards that. Susan Solomon gives you another Academy report called Climate Stabilization Targets. Here's the membership here. Susan was, by the way, the co-chair of Working Group 1 of the fourth assessment report, and also one of the people that made the connection between CFC concentrations above Antarctica and the depletion of the ozone hole. But her process is trying to think about how much risk is acceptable, and societies accept risk all of the time in building codes and behavior codes and things like that. Then determine what is at risk and the association of those risks with increases in temperature and therefore increases in emissions. And then the appropriate choice depends on how you put those together. And the scientific community actually can't tell you how to do that. That has to be political. What the scientific community can do is tell you that this picture is right. That stabilizing concentrations is not the same thing as stabilizing emissions. That to stabilize concentrations, you have to lower the rate of emissions to the point where the degree to which it depreciates out of the atmosphere is equal to the rate at which you're putting it into the atmosphere. There's a great concern that there is an enormous amount of confusion with respect to that. Nobody gets it that it's a bathtub and there's a faucet and we're running this faucet at increasing rates and there's a drain that has a limited capacity. It's not enough to stop increasing the rate of flow of the water. We have to reduce the flow of the water so it matches what the drain can accommodate. A clue to how the limiting panel approached the U.S. perspective is built here. What Susan was able to do is sort of reverse the conversation and think about, looks like that guy, global mean temperature range with respect to cumulative emissions. Concentrations depend on cumulative emissions over time, and so you get to add these sorts of things up, and you can, instead of thinking about what's the range of temperature associated with a particular amount of cumulative emissions, what you can say is what is the range of cumulative emissions that would be consistent with a particular temperature target that you might have in mind. This dotted line is what we've done so far. So 1 degree of warming is pretty much exhausted. We're in the middle, the blue bars are the best guesses of the cumulative amount that would be consistent with that warming, and those little boxy things indicate the range of uncertainty around those. But we've pretty much done 1 degree and are committed to it. For 2 degrees, there's some degree of flexibility, but we've already emitted half of our budget. For 3 degrees, we've emitted less than that, but probably nobody in this room wants to talk terribly seriously about 3 degrees. You might not even want to talk about 2. The bad news is that in terms of convincing people that this is a problem, the new science suggests that we observe about half of the temperature increases for increases in concentrations that will ultimately occur in equilibrium. So that, for example, if we were to pick 350 degrees, we might observe, or 350 parts per million, we might observe a half a degree warming, but over the long term, that really commits us to perhaps as much as 1.4 degrees centigrade warming. For 450, it goes similarly. So the point is that the impacts that we see are driven by transient increases in warming, not the global equilibrium, long-run equilibrium. Once we get to the long-run equilibrium, it stays there for thousands of years. So the limiting panel said, okay, that's fine. What we should do is take into account the iterative part, try to think about a budget for the United States through 2050 that will allow us to get the train out of the station. Energy Modeling Forum had done some work for 2 different budgets that were consistent with getting to a pathway close to 550 parts per million by the middle of the century, and then making an adjustment thereafter. The point that they made was that business as usual exhausts those budgets in about 15 years, so there's a significant amount of work that needs to be done. But the models indicate that it's possible. There's a collection of new technologies and existing technologies that could put together achieve the budgets that they were calling for. Now, there's some bad ideas of how to approach this problem. One is to subsidize emissions. Here's a little graph for students. There's a derived demand for emissions on the downward sloping business. What you could envision is that there's a maximum amount of pollution associated, or emissions of carbon associated with that derived demand if it's taxed at 0, priced at 0. There's an economic optimum where marginal cost equals marginal benefit that you could achieve by taxing it so that people emit carbon up to this particular point and choose the optimal amount. Or some people might think about subsidizing it starting here and subsidizing units of emissions that are not thrown into the effluent. The reason that's a bad idea, even though there's a certainty equivalence here, is that that subsidy lowers the average cost of production and produces a counterbalancing effect of increasing output. Another potentially bad idea, and Dan Lashoff will talk about this to some degree, is sort of the regulation of sources and best practices and things like that. Part of the concern is, one, that they get locked in and written in concrete. The other is ultimately they end up with dramatically different marginal costs of the benefits that they achieve over the regulations that are occurring. This is old numbers from 1996 from Kip Viscusi suggesting the cost of saving a life in the United States through a variety of controls that have been imposed. So there are reasons to price carbon. We'll talk a lot about those. But the one I wanted to emphasize, because I'm not sure people would talk about it more, is that if it indeed is a budget problem, and if it is indeed a cumulative emissions problem, then hoteling solved that problem a long time ago. It's a scarce, exhaustible resource problem over a period of time, and the answer is calculate a scarcity rent and let it go up at the rate of interest. So you add onto the price of carbon, or price of and then it transfers for the economy, the price of, say, of a fossil fuel, add a scarcity rent that's associated with the carbon content of that fuel, and let that addition go up at the rate of interest. The reason that works so well is that price elasticities of demands of products relate to percentage changes in the quantity over percentage changes in the price. They're different depending on the sectors and things like that, but this persistent percentage increase year after year that's predictable compounds over time and makes the effect of the carbon tax greater than the increase in the 1 year at a time, let's put it that way. So, here's the state of events. One surprising thing is that Bush 43 actually signed legislation that put a price on carbon at $20 a ton of CO2 if you sequester carbon dioxide in a hard geologic formation somewhere in the contiguous United States. Frank will talk about the social cost of carbon. I want to talk about this, and then perhaps I will close, or if I get another minute, I want to talk about the 6 Americas. Cap and trade was a good idea for sulfur. Why is that? That's because variability in the emissions of sulfur would cause increases in the acidity of lakes and forests and things like that that would cause damages. This horizontal line is a threshold where damages occur, and they depend on annual emissions, or maybe even shorter than that. So variability in emissions was harmful, and it was something to avoid. And so cap and trade will allow the maximum flexibility across a variety of sectors, subject to the constraint that the total level of emissions in a particular airshed was held to a particular level. For climate policy, it strikes me that that doesn't apply, that this variability along this trajectory, which on average looks exactly like that, will create the same cumulative level of emissions, the same increase in atmospheric concentrations, and therefore the same temperature implications. There is no extra cost for allowing extra variability from year to year across sources as long as it averages out. So that's why I'm in favor of taxes rather than cap and trade. I'm in favor of cap and trade relative to nothing. And frankly, the limiting panel on the Uber committee, if you said, if the Congress does not price carbon over the next year or two, or 1 year or 2 terms, you might not get a majority of the people on those panels to say that it's appropriate to do anything. That there's so much efficiency embedded in pricing carbon and so much potential efficiency elsewhere. Let's not do this. This is what I want to do, because this was precipitated by what I heard last night. Social scientists do lots of things, and these guys, Tony Liesewitz and Ed Maibach, are political scientists that do a lot of surveying. And one of the things that they've done is survey attitudes towards climate across the United States. This was published in June. These numbers vary, but they found 6 different categories of Americans. Just about everybody in this room was over here. You're either alarmed or concerned. There are a number of people in the middle that are cautious or disengaged, and then there are people that are doubtful or dismissive, otherwise known as skeptics with a capital S rather than a small s. That's one bit of information, but this is the more important bit of information. What they found is that there are 3 fundamental questions that American people want to hear the answers to, and it depends on what category of people you're in about what questions you want to hear. People in this room want to know, what can we do about it? Let's get our butts in gear and get out there and do something. People over here, sorry. People over here want to know, how do you know? Now, I'm not convinced that you will convince them that you know and it is unequivocal and humans are to blame, but what that question tells you is how they're going to attack you. What it is they are going to yell at you and scream about in trying to get other people in the middle to think that their ideas of dismiss or doubt are the appropriate things. So if you're going to engage those people in conversation, you have to be able to talk coherently about how we know that this is happening. And the people in the middle, what harm will it do to them? They don't need to know about the catastrophes. They need to know about what's going to happen to them and their family over the foreseeable future in ways that make some sense. Susan Solomon has come up with a graph, a map of the United States that asks people to read the graph in the following way. Envision the warmest summer that you have experienced in the last 20 years. And then she puts on a map of the United States that plots across the United States the percentage likelihood that with 1 degree to 2 degrees of further warming, I think it's further warming, what will be the likelihood that any particular year that you experience after that warming will look like the 1 in 20 summer that you've got right now. Once you get to 1 degree, for most of the country, it's 95 to 99%. So the 1 in 20 hot summer becomes the just about every year hot summer. And if you were uncomfortable in that one hot summer in the last 2 decades, get used to it. And that's something that seems to be conveying the message. Thank you for a little bit of extra time.